Hey there, and welcome back to another Disney video. And a couple of weeks ago, I made a video talking about the legacy of the Walt Disney classic, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The animated sensation that started it all and catapulted Walt Disney Animations to superstardom and forged a legacy that endures to this day. And coming into that film, I really didn't expect much for some reason. Like, I'd seen it as a kid, and I enjoyed it then, but I somehow got it in my head that the older Disney films were massively overrated, and they weren't as good as people would lead you to believe. I don't know why I got such a notion in my head in the first place, but I guess it is what it is. And whilst it certainly was a different experience, and the storytelling techniques were different, I was definitely wrong. And it was a really good movie. And I can see why it has such an enduring legacy. And so, since there seems to be a million Pinocchio films coming out in the next year or so, I figured I'd move on to the next Disney classic on the list, and have a rewatch of 1940's Pinocchio. And you'd think I would have learnt my lesson from the first time that I sat down to watch an old classic, but I'm sorry to say I didn't. And then I found myself already sitting there with a negative opinion about the film, without even having turned it on yet. I believe my exact words were along the lines of, "Oh yeah, Snow White was good, but I remember Pinocchio. It sucks, it's so overrated. I don't know why people like it, it's so weird." And honestly, I don't know why I always seem to find myself saying this kind of dumb shit and then looking like a major clown after the fact, because yes, once again, I was wrong. Pinocchio does not suck, and I can fully understand its popularity and the legacy it's left behind. I get why it's so beloved now, and I wish I could tell you that I've learned my lesson from this experience, but I probably haven't if I'm being honest with myself. Oh well, on to the movie! Released in 1940, Pinocchio tells the story of Pinocchio, a little wooden puppet created by the lonely woodcarver Geppetto, who's always wanted a child, but never had one. Brought to life by the magic of the Blue Fairy, Pinocchio's told that as long as he's brave, truthful, and unselfish, he will become a real boy. Obviously, as he's basically a newborn kid, expecting these things from him right out of the gate is a bit of a tall order. And so, a vagrant cricket named Jiminy is drafted into service by the fairy to service his conscience and teach him right from wrong, with limited success. And honestly, Jiminy doesn't really help him grow as a person all that much. He really just bails him out when everything goes to shit. But anyway, over the course of the story, Pinocchio faces numerous adversities and triumphs over each of them, learning a new lesson every time. First, he blows off school and becomes an actor under the employ of travelling puppeteer Stromboli to tremendous success. And in fact, he's so successful that he finds himself kidnapped and imprisoned by Stromboli, who threatens to chop him into firewood if he doesn't comply. Luckily, he finds himself rescued from this fate by Jiminy and the Blue Fairy, who gives him yet another chance to prove himself brave, truthful, and unselfish. But of course, he falls back in with the wrong crowd again and heads off to Pleasure Island, a magical island where young boys are able to have the time of their lives and engage in endless fighting, smoking, and vandalism, but bad luck for them because it turns out this is a place where naughty boys are turned into donkeys and sold off as slave labour, which is dark, but we'll come back to that. Anyway, of course, Pinocchio, now part donkey himself, is saved once again by Jiminy, and the two escape the island and return home, only to find out that Geppetto's gone and gotten himself eaten by a whale of titanic proportions named Monstro. And so now the pair need to go out into the ocean to try and find this psycho whale, get eaten, and save Geppetto. And against the odds, they actually manage to do this and evade the monster, making it back to land safely. Except for Pinocchio, of course, who sacrifices himself to save them all, and is thus revived and turned into a real boy by the Blue Fairy, with the family living happily ever after. And much like its predecessor in Disney canon, Snow White, Pinocchio was a smash hit in terms of its critical performance and its lasting legacy. At the time of its release, it was pretty much acknowledged as the gold standard for an animated entertainment experience. There aren't that many criticisms that can really be levelled at the film, except for, the racist bits. I'm pretty sure Stromboli and the Native American depictions on Pleasure Island would not fly in any which way in the modern film industry, and for good reason. They're racist, and not funny. But even that's more of a modern critique. At the time, I can't really find anybody that thought this film was bad. It was basically just the base elements of Snow White, but better. The animation had improved by leaps and bounds, with a particular improvement on character animation and design. Faces were far less static, and the mouths synced up with the words they were saying much better. Backgrounds were better designed, they were less static, there was more going on. After all, Snow White's backgrounds were static, painted. And there's nothing wrong with that, it was made in 1937 for God's sake, but regardless, Pinocchio improved on that formula. It just created more visual diversity in the scenes to make them come to life. The score was more memorable, so memorable in fact that Disney derived its own theme song from this film, I mean, the moment When You Wish Upon a Star hits, all I can ever think of is those old Disney intros with the Disney castle in white on the blue background. In this film, they created a song that transcended any other song they've made before or since, and it's become a legend in and of itself. And yeah, I realize that sounds a bit dramatic, but it's true. Literally everybody knows that song. Even if you don't know the words or you haven't seen the movie, you know the theme. I mean, kids are born knowing this stuff now. And then on top of that, we have a really well-constructed narrative, but one that felt unique in a way, kind of different to how movies are constructed these days. And I said that about Snow White as well, but that too feels a little bit different. Snow White was just a storybook, but come to life. The story itself, though, was pretty basic. It was more about the experience, the spectacle, being a visual marvel with uplifting songs. And yes, Pinocchio retained that too. It too felt like a living picture book. It too was a visual feast. It too had beautiful songs that gave you that sense of wonder and excitement and a nostalgia for a time long since past. But it also improved on the formula. It had a more complex narrative, a story that focused on the hero's journey of Pinocchio and how he has to overcome his vices and demons in order to prove himself worthy of being a real boy. Unlike a lot of other Disney films, it doesn't really hone in on a conflict with a main villain. It develops the character instead, and thus, it divides itself into different chapters that almost feel like episodes of a miniseries as opposed to one standalone film. The first episode focuses on the birth of Pinocchio and his encounter with Stromboli. The second follows his journey to Pleasure Island and the horrors that await him there. And the third, his completion of his hero's journey as he saves his father from the whale Monstro. And honestly, I found this approach to the storytelling really refreshing. A variety of villains and situations for Pinocchio to contend with each of them showing off how he's changed as a character over time, even if only slightly. And I think a lot of people agree, even now, that this film is really incredible and has aged very well. After all, on Rotten Tomatoes, even now it manages to maintain a 100% critical score off of 58 reviews, which I know isn't that many, but it's still decent. And it has an audience score of 73%, which seems low until you factor in that it has 250,000 plus reviews, which I find to be quite impressive, especially since people seem to mark down films for the weirdest reasons. Seriously, just read some. They can be ridiculous. And on top of that, the film won 2 Academy Awards for Best Score and Best Song, whilst also getting added to the National Film Registry for its cultural significance in 1994. And honestly, I think the only real dark spot in this film's legacy is that it was a box office bomb at the time of its release. And whilst it did well in America, World War II pretty much shut down the markets in Europe and Asia, and so it bombed. And whilst it would eventually recoup its losses and more via re-releases over the next few decades, it'll always have that mark next to its name. At the time of its release, box office bomb. The worst thing a film can be. And that's a shame, because this thing, it just deserved all the money. It really is one of a kind, and honestly, it's probably Disney's best Golden Age film. And I would argue it's in contention for their best film ever. And maybe that's my recency bias clouding my judgment, but I don't care, it's awesome. Great animation, great story, great music, that fairy tale quality that just absorbs you into the world, and then having some really heavy shit, like some really dark stuff. Like, suddenly the film pivots into naughty boys getting turned into donkeys to be sold into slavery whilst they beg for their mamas to save them, and then they just get left there. Pinocchio can't help them. They're sold as slaves. And then there's just Monstro in general. He's scary as. Or there's when Pinocchio just gets turned into a corpse. Seriously, he's just face down in the surf like he's on an episode of Law and Order. And I think it was really astounding that they were able to balance these darker elements with that patented Disney magic and create a true masterpiece. And honestly, there really isn't much else to say. It's just a masterpiece. But as always, these are just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of Pinocchio? You like it, hate it? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.